Welcome to another episode of Inflection. I am Brian Berletic. Joining me as always is Angelo Giuliano. Hello, Angelo. How are you doing?
Hi, Brian. Doing great. Thank you.
Okay, great to have you here. We're going to need your expertise. We're going to be talking about a couple of different things, all related, but the main topic is going to be China in Afghanistan. What are they doing in Afghanistan right now? What do they want to do? And what is the US going to try to do to stop it? Because of course they're going to. Before we get into that, there's a couple of other directly related news stories, because all of this is all about, some people call it US-China competition, but I would say that this is actually a conflict. And well, maybe we'll see in just a moment why that might be. But here are these US-backed protests in Thailand. So what the US is doing is trying to encircle and contain China, and they're doing this by destabilizing all of China's partners in the region, in Asia, along its periphery. And so they're doing that in Thailand. Thailand right now has a very close relationship with China, biggest trade partner. China is their biggest investor, biggest source of tourism, cooperating across military and infrastructure spheres, and they're building a high-speed rail line from Kunming to Bangkok through Laos. And so they're stirring up trouble to stop this. And here's Al Jazeera, and people need to keep in mind, Al Jazeera is Qatari state media, and they go along with the US on everything, just about. So Thailand, thousands joined Bangkok rally demanding PM's resignation. And what happened was, we're recording this on a Sunday, so yesterday they voted in parliament. It was a no confidence vote against the prime minister, and he passed. Nobody's going to be voting him out except the US-backed opposition, and they didn't have the numbers. And in the lead up to that, they were staging these protests. Now, you look at this picture, even in this picture, Angelo, does that look like thousands to you? Like, you know, when you say thousands, you think like 4,000 or more, right? Up to 10,000. No. And they pick a picture like this instead of like an aerial view to really show the numbers, because they don't have the numbers. And if you look at this picture, which is taken from above, this is the whole protest. So this is the intersection and the stage right here. There's the MRT station, and you can see right across from the MRT station and the corner of this building, that's where it stops. And then right over here is the other MRT station. So that's all that showed up. That's not even 1,000 people, not even 8,000. Al Jazeera is saying thousands. Angelo, why do you think Al Jazeera is trying to artificially inflate the numbers? They don't know how to count, or they're doing this deliberately?
Well, it's just deliberate. I saw it live. It was just a few hundreds. Well, you have to keep in mind that this was like Asok area, a very busy intersection in Bangkok. And probably half of the people were just bystanders. Why? Because you put in music, you put a concert on, and it's a busy area. So of course you are going to have bystanders. So at most, like just a few hundred protesters. I think it's interesting to see, like, to follow those Western media, because sometimes they are advanced indicators. So they make it sound big, this protest, when it's a non-event. So we need to ask the questions: what is behind this? Why are they propping up something which is a non-event?
Exactly. And of course, the reason is these protests in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Malaysia, as they were in Hong Kong, they're US-backed, and they want to try to make them seem as big and as powerful as possible, because the goal is to create maximum destabilization, possibly get a client regime into power, but short of that, just stirring up as much trouble as possible. And if Al Jazeera and the local media, if they said dwindling protest, not even 1,000 showed up, if they said how big the population of Bangkok was, 12 to 14 million people, and then this is all that showed up, people would start putting the pieces of the puzzle together and say, this movement has no public support. And then it would fall apart. And their job is to keep it going long after expiration date. The next story we're going to talk about is about Kamala Harris in Vietnam. So last week, Angelo, we talked about Singapore. This week, let's talk about what Kamala Harris was doing in Vietnam. But before we do that, I just want to set the stage here. Where did Vietnam export to in 2019? So this is the Atlas of Economic Complexity from Harvard University. It's a very useful tool. It's got a timeline down here so you can see how this has changed over time. But number one export market for Vietnam is China. And then when you add Hong Kong to it, and you should, because they're integrated, it's almost a quarter of their trade goes to China. And then the United States is number two, and that's about a fifth almost of, so that's a significant export market. Vietnam wouldn't want to jeopardize either one of these. This is very important to their economy. And then when we look at imports, China alone dwarfs all of these regions combined: Europe, North America, South America, Australia, and everyone else. So China is Vietnam's largest, most important trade partner. So when you see a headline like this, Harris urges Vietnam to join U.S. in opposing China bullying. It would be like, I'm asking you to push your business partner down the stairs. Do you want to do that? Angelo, what do you think? Just seeing this headline, what do you think about this?
Vietnamese won't be fooled. You saw what happened in Ukraine. Ukraine was a great partner of Russia, and for a long time, for centuries, and it dropped Russia in favor of the US and EU. And what happened? Did the EU and US both, lifted the economy of Ukraine? No, it just dropped Ukraine. Ukraine now is going to lose $3 billion of transit fees because of Nord Stream 2. Russia is going to bypass Ukraine and is going to sell its gas directly to Germany. So you see, they just Vietnam is not going to be used like other countries. It's no fault. In Asia, there's a saying that you need to favor better a close friend than the relative that is living far away. So your neighbor is much more important than a distant relative because you have to live on a daily basis with your neighbor. The US, how many miles away it is? How much inflation? And again, the facts are that US is in decline. Do you want to follow with the US, or do you want to follow history? And history is showing that China is not an emerging power. It's re-emerging. China is only taking back its original position it had for centuries, thousands of years.
Yeah, really good point. And people should remember that Vietnam had rocky relations with both the US and China. But okay, so the war the US waged on Vietnam was obviously many times more devastating than the botched Chinese invasion of Vietnam. But when we look at China then, and the US then, and then China now, and the US now, China's a completely different country. After Mao Zedong passed away, a lot of reform took place. It's not even really fair to say that it's the same China with the same motivations and method of operation. The US is exactly the same, or actually even worse now than it was when it was just carpet bombing Vietnam for 20 years. And so I think Vietnam will keep all of that in mind. And then when you go through this article, you will see the first 3 paragraphs is the US complaining about China in the South China Sea. Now, is the US a claimant in the South China Sea? No, it has to cross an entire ocean just to stick its nose in this issue. And I like to show people this map, because this map highlights something very important that the United States never mentions. It's not just China having a dispute with Vietnam or the Philippines or Malaysia or Indonesia. All of these countries have disputes with each other over the South China Sea. This is multiple overlapping disputes. And that's what they are. They're just disputes. We've talked about this before, where England and France have disputes over fishing waters. They don't go to war. Sometimes the rhetoric gets heated, but then they bilaterally overcome them and patch up relations. And that's what happens in the South China Sea all the time. And what the US is doing, it's inserting itself into these minor disputes and trying to inflate them into a regional, if not international conflict. And because no one is having it, they have to bring in Japan, Australia, India, even England and France. They have to bring them in because no one in the region that's actually a claimant in these disputes wants to be a part of this. So that's the number one thing the US wants Vietnam to sign up for, turning normal disputes into a conflict with Vietnam's largest trade partner. And they say things about COVID-19, they're donating vaccines, basically vaccines that were going to expire anyway. And then, let's see, what was the other thing? Clean energy. So that's about the US trying to stop Vietnam from building more coal plants with China and build liquid natural gas plants instead. And then they need to import US liquid natural gas to Vietnam, again, crossing an entire ocean. And it's going to be more expensive. So this is what the US is offering Vietnam. Anything you want to add on to this, Angelo, before I go on to where Vietnam stands with all of this with China?
Well, I can see that the US has no vision. Look at what it is doing. It's coming up with some version of the Belt and Road Initiative, but nothing is factual. There's no plan. There's no, in terms of size, it's going to be much smaller. So there's no vision. It's about copying and trying to be better than China. Why would you want to do that? I mean, and again, why? There are so many internal problems already in the US. Why don't you start taking care of your own problems in the US? I mean, before trying to improve other countries and bring supposedly those freedom, democracy, human rights. I mean, take care of your human rights back at home.
And while the US is offering Vietnam all of these kind of rotten, already bitten carrots, they also have the stick, and that comes in the form of National Endowment for Democracy funded opposition groups that protest inside Vietnam. They try to stir up nationalists to put pressure on the government regarding China. But let's take a look at what China isn't offering Vietnam. They've already implemented this. This is already happening. So this is from Xinhua. China-Europe freight train marks first connection between Zhengzhou, Hanoi, and Liege, and this is in Belgium. And so what is this? This is China with its Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road. It's a rail line that goes through China, across Russia, and into Europe. And now they've connected Vietnam to this freight line. And now Vietnam has another option when they want to export. And I mean, if we go back to here and we look at exports, I think Europe actually used to be the second largest export market for Vietnam way back when, like maybe let's go back to the 90s. Yeah, used to be the second largest export market, and now it's not. So this rail line that China is giving Vietnam access to is going to help them sell more products to Europe and vice versa. And also every country that the line passes through on its way to Europe, these are new potential markets for Vietnam. And shipping freight by rail is cheaper than sending it by ship, and also faster in some instances. And this is the article from Vietnam News, the National English Language Daily. The link to this will be in the video description. They kind of give some of the details. It's not a massive operation. It's the first trial run, and this is something that's going to expand gradually over time. Angelo, what do you think about this when you compare this to the U.S. trying to pressure Vietnam into buying liquid natural gas from the other side of the planet? I mean, how do you compare and contrast?
Well, it's first of all, it's more expensive, and then it's not ecological. It's the same as the U.S. wanted to sell liquefied gas to Germany. while Germany could just buy from Russia and using a pipeline. Using a pipeline is more ecological. So it's in contradiction with the sustainable development and the transition. So it's just hypocrisy. And why? It's just, you need to be pragmatic. Why would I want to buy more expensive gas? And again, you need to diversify supply. So China is doing the same. It's not putting all its eggs in the same basket.
And what do you think about China hooking Vietnam up to this China-Europe freight line?
Well, the freight line makes absolutely sense. Freight line, one of the advantages is to cut the lead time. The lead time is cut by 10 to 15 days. So it doesn't apply. Actually, it might be slightly more expensive than sea freight. Depending on which country you're sending your goods to, you have it's either only sea freight or you have sea freight plus land. And the land actually costs a lot when it's by truck. When it's by rail, it's cheaper. So here it's more like diversify routes, because it's always good to have an alternative between sea routes and land routes. And also lead time. Lead time is important. You actually making the trades closer. It's a rapprochement of countries in Eurasia. So it's important that they diminish like the lead time. It's enormous when you think about 10, 15 days for high value goods. It's extremely important.
Exactly, and also for supply chains that order things on short notice. I mean, having a shorter travel time for those parts means much more flexibility. So again, it's the U.S. making all of these promises, and they're not even on paper, they're not really good-looking promises. And then here is China just hooking Vietnam up to this freight line, and it's already being used. And you could say, 23 containers on one trip, big deal, but that's already being done right now. It's not on paper. It's something that they're doing, and it's capacity that they're going to build out over time. And this is what China has been doing for the last couple of decades. That's how it suddenly it's such a big issue, because China does these things very gradually, very patiently, and then finally there's like this critical mass that it reaches, and then suddenly the US decides to start panicking. And let us go to, and Angelo, I already did a video on this, and then you sent me that other article, and I just thought this is a really important news piece to go over, the terrorism in Myanmar. And Angelo, you and I, when we were talking about the situation in Myanmar, I think we started as soon as it started in February, people said, "Oh, you got it all wrong. And these are real protesters. They're real, people power and pro-democracy, and you're a tanky, and I said, no, they're violent, they're terrorists, and just give it time and all the truth will come out." And Myanmar now is not Myanmar state media. It's not Chinese or Russian state media. It's opposition media funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. We've gone over that many times. And this is an entire article about these People's Defense Forces bragging about how they murdered 6 railway police. So they're on the train just to make sure the train is a safe place for people. And they went on the train and they killed these 6 men, and they stole their weapons, and they're bragging about it. They show the dead police officer. They show the terrorists bragging about how they took his weapon and all these other weapons. There's a couple of really telling. Let me see if I can find it here. Angelo, when you first read this article, what were you thinking?
Well, this is nothing less than a terrorism. Again, they're not even killing militaries. I mean, they're killing civil servants. We're talking about mayors, town village leaders. So it's just terrorism. And then. So I wouldn't be surprised that PDF, this entity, this terrorist entity, will be listed as a terrorist entity, because it's nothing else.
And let's see what the guy who's bragging about this to Myanmar now, let's see what he himself says. And again, people have to remember, this is opposition media. I know we're going to have comments in the comment section saying you're funded by Myanmar military. This is the opposition media. Has nothing to do with the military. So they're saying, according to La Pie Wan, that means that anyone in uniform who continues to work for the junta, including traffic police, firefighters, and even Red Cross workers, is fair game. That is this is the People Defense Force admitting that they're going to violate the Geneva Conventions. They're obviously doing that, but they're also saying that they're doing it as a matter of deliberate policy, that they're going to just murder anyone cooperating with the government. And we've talked about this before, not this one, this was back in June. This was when the PDF terrorists were attacking schools. And there was this Reuters article here where the teachers are so afraid that they go to school in normal clothing and change in their uniforms only inside the school. Now, when we see him saying that anyone in uniform is going to die, now we know why the teachers change their clothes at school and they don't wear their uniform in public. Because the US-backed pro-democracy protesters will gun them down, will murder them just for thinking differently than them. That doesn't sound like democracy to me. And then there's this one: attackers in Yangon kill suspected military informant, then detonate bombs when junta forces arrive to investigate. The killer said the targeted Tin Mung Win because he had people arrested for their alleged role in torching Chinese factories. So this was something else we said was going on, and everyone denied. Yes, they're torching Chinese factories because they're US-backed opposition. They hate China, even though it makes absolutely no sense. It's not in Myanmar's best interests, but this is the nature of an imperial proxy. This is what they do. They will destroy their own country. They will cut their own wrists, and they will bleed themselves out. And if you come down here, this is what they say to Myanmar Now, the newspaper, the opposition newspaper. We shot him 4 times and planted 3 bombs for the dogs, but only 2 of them detonated. And then they're just talking about how he deserved to die. He posed no threat to them. He just had different political views. He was cooperating with the government, and they opposed the government, so they murdered him. This sounds exactly like the terrorists in Syria. Angelo, do you remember before it became obvious that they were all ISIS and Al-Qaeda, how the Western media would tell these kind of stories, and people would say, doesn't that sound like terrorism? And they would deny it up and down. How does this strike you, these 2 stories?
It's the same model, the same playbook. Additional to that, they're actually asking for R2P, responsibility to protect. So there's also freezing of accounts. There's a government in exile. It's the same thing. It's the same, you can draw many parallels, like in Venezuela, Juan Guaido. They have the same in Myanmar. And keeping in mind that for people that don't understand Myanmar's oppositions, this movement led by Aung San Suu Kyi, it's a movement that has been hijacked completely by the US through the National Endowment for Democracy, Open Society of Soros. And what the media are doing right now in Myanmar is restoring sovereignty, because again, we repeat it over and over, you cannot have democracy if you don't have sovereignty. So it's a preconditions. So the first thing that Myanmar needs to do is having stronger national security laws and getting the communication, because all the medias have been funded by the US. So this communication here, we're just bringing an alternative to mainstream media by doing some research and just stating facts. Actually, most of the news we are giving we're using actually US-backed media like Myanmar Now. It's actually very difficult because they are actually saying that they're putting bombs, but and then after that they're even saying that they are freedom fighters. I mean, how can you do that? How can you put bombs into schools and call yourself a freedom fighter? You are a terrorist. The achievement so far when it comes to schools is 25% of kids are not going to school. I mean, how good does it do to your country? How good does it do to your country? When you're asking for foreign interventions, what good does it do to your country? I mean, those kids that are actually backing foreign intervention, they should learn about history. I mean, it's Myanmar. I mean, before it was Burma, gained its independence. And it was a hard-fought independence. Why are you asking, for interference? Foreign intervention doesn't make any sense. It's just ridiculous. So it's again, Myanmar is another country that had never actually gained its independence. Remember, when they actually give you independence, they're leaving the seeds of revolutions. It's like Gladio operation. It's the same as what is happening in Afghanistan. Don't believe that the US is leaving without planting the seeds for disruption. It's going to be terrorists. It's going to be all those NGOs. Imagine those fundings with millions of dollars in poor countries, developing countries. It goes a long, long way.
Absolutely, and that's a perfect springboard into our main topic about how the U.S. is leaving behind a mess in Afghanistan. But you said these youths need to study history, even if they don't find history interesting or appealing. They could just look at current events, look at what the U.S. did to Afghanistan, how they left Afghanistan. Can't they see themselves handing their baby up to U.S. Marines, trying to get them on the last plane out of Kabul? Can't they see that? Can't they see what the U.S. has done, and that nothing that they say or do is said in good faith, how they are using, abusing, exploiting, and then discarding absolutely everyone, including their own, the way they treat their own people in the process of all this, the way those Marines died in the last days in Kabul. Totally unnecessary. And one point I wanted to make about this last one that you sent right before the show, where they're attacking the Chinese factories. This is why I say it's not really U.S.-Chinese competition. This is a conflict. This is the same as if the U.S. just had B-52s rolling over Myanmar, bombing Chinese factories. The difference is we're in the 21st century. Just like you said, Angela, they have the way of manipulating people through social media, through the media, and transforming these people into weapons of mass destruction. As a matter of fact, Angela, do you remember the BBC segment on the Oslo Freedom Forum and how they said they basically transformed those Hong Kong activists into weapons of mass destruction to ruin Hong Kong?
We've been told many of Hong Kong's demonstrators were trained long before taking to the streets to use non-violent action, as they describe it, as a weapon of mass destruction.
Protesters were taught how to behave during a protest, so how to keep ranks, how to speak to police, how to manage their own movement, how to use marshals within their movement. So these are people who are specially trained. It's also, how to behave when arrested. Practical things like the need for food and water. That movement can last longer when people are taken care of, and also how to manage a water cannon being used against you, and other types of police violence.
It's meticulous.
Absolutely.
This is what they've done in Myanmar. They don't need to use B-52s. They could have these terrorists burn down the Chinese factories that way. It's a much more cost-effective way to do it. It's cheaper politically. Less risky for the United States to do it in this very indirect manner. And so this is why I say the US and China are already at conflict with one another. The US is doing it through proxies. They are along China's peripheries, destroying Chinese property, attacking Chinese nationals. What they're doing in Western Pakistan, for example, in Baluchistan, trying to kill the Chinese ambassador, attacking infrastructure, killing engineers. This is a conflict. And inside China, the whole Xinjiang issue is exactly the same. So maybe we go into our main topic here, which is what is China doing in Afghanistan, and what is the US going to do to stop them? Now, I got this, I don't know if people have ever seen this building, but this is actually this is called Chinatown in Kabul. And it's this kind of like a complex And Chinese companies occupy this complex, and this is where they're doing business in Afghanistan right now. They import Chinese goods and they sell it to people in Afghanistan. And this is supposed to be kind of a center where they expand out. And a lot of Chinese investors and businessmen and business people in general, they come here to do this. So this is in Kabul right now already. Let's see, there were some articles that you also sent, Angelo. Do you want to talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Afghanistan?
Yeah, absolutely. Just just going back to the picture you showed just before. I mean, the Chinese, the Chinese didn't wait the Taliban for starting doing business with Afghanistan and putting the foundation for rebuilding Afghanistan. It started already a while ago. So now we have what is interesting about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a kind of a counterbalance, somehow a counterbalance to NATO, with the difference that you have India inside. It's interesting. Maybe India might be playing both sides, and I think it's a good option also for India. But there are actually talks about Afghanistan joining SCO, and additional to that, actually Iran is going to join SCO. What is interesting also, if you look at the composition of SCO, is all Eurasia, and it's mainly helping those countries which are landlocked. All those, especially when it comes to all those USSR countries that are completely landlocked, and they need the Belt and Road Initiative in order to develop. So I would say it's the version of the Belt and Road Initiative for Eurasia, but more like for security purpose. So you see, there are talks about this Cold War, between China and the USA, but in reality, there are facts on the ground. When you see that in Afghanistan, the Chinese already started a few years ago, starting to build the business. Well, it's showing you that there's the on the ground trade. We need to look at trades and business, and that is showing actually the advanced indicators for what is going to happen. So now, when it comes to Afghanistan, there's a few things that are interesting. Is that you see how much the US and the West cares about Afghanistan. They're cutting the aid of the IMF and the World Bank, completely cutting the aid. Keep in mind that the aid in Afghanistan amounts for 40% of Afghanistan GDP. So how much do you care about Afghanistan when you completely cutting the aid of Afghanistan? Then they're actually taking $9 billion US. They're just blocking $9 billion US that are in the US banks. How much do you care about Afghanistan when you're blocking this money, which is extremely important for Afghanistan? So now this is a stage where the West is actually choking Afghanistan. Taliban took over. Now we are going to choke Afghanistan. And additional to that, don't believe that the US is leaving without putting the seeds for disruption. We saw it over and over. Gladio operation in World War II was the same. You leave behind agents for disruption. Don't believe that 20 years of presence in Afghanistan is going to be like left. They're going to leave alone Afghanistan like this. No. There are seeds for disruptions. It can come in many different forms. CIA agents. All the NGOs that are still going to be there, USA, they'll be active and they'll create disruption. And it's not going to help Afghanistan. It's going to be, they are going to target many different aspects of Afghani society. It can be, the Belt and Road Initiative. It can be the civil society. It can be giving arms to Massoud in the Panjshir, so Afghanistan it's not over. Don't believe it's over.
And I think that point about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because you're basically saying that the U.S. is going to create security crises inside of Afghanistan, around Afghanistan, and everywhere else where they're already doing it, like in Western Pakistan. And so maybe membership in the SCO can give Afghanistan the resources that it needs to actually really stabilize the country versus what the US was doing, which was just occupying it. And they had this artificial order that they put into place that they never intended to endure once they left. And you're talking about freezing assets and withdrawing aid. And this is, what does that do? What does poverty and ignorance do? It breeds extremism. So they're setting the stage to create this extremism. Let's see. I want to show people. I think it's this one. So this is actually where China and Afghanistan meet. They share a border, a very small border, and through this pass, there's a lot of speculation about China building a corridor through here, transportation and economic corridor through here into Afghanistan. And what I kind of want to, one point I kind of want to make, and let's see if you agree with this or not, or have something to add to it. US reconstruction in Afghanistan did not work because they had these contractors coming in from the US. They give them these contracts. They don't care if the project is even completed or not. And then once it's completed, they don't care what happens to it. They leave Afghanistan, they go back and spend their money somewhere else. And then if the project doesn't fail, that's actually even better for them, because then they could come back and get another contract to rebuild it or come up with another alternative for that failed project. The difference with China is that they're there to actually do business. They live in Afghanistan. They are trying to build businesses in Afghanistan. Some of these articles, and again, they're all going to be linked to in the video description below, and they all come from Western sources, so there's going to be bias in them, but there's also a lot of really good points that are made. They're planning on building power plants. There's projects there that need power plants to operate because there's shortages of energy, and this is something that the Taliban or whoever's going to be in the government, they're going to want to build that power plant. Actually, before the Taliban came in, China was doing business with the other government, the US-backed government, and they wanted China to build the power plant, and China wants to build the power plant. So this is why it's going to get done versus why 20 years of reconstruction for the US disappeared almost literally overnight. And so the only thing that's going to complicate or impede China, and they talk about this mining operation, a copper mine that China invested in, and how no progress has been made. Why not? Because of security issues. They're trying to demine the location where they're going to do their mining. So demine, I mean the explosives used in war, not the mine where you extract resources. So it's security problems that are hindering development in Afghanistan. And the US is going to do everything in their power to compound those security crises, to impede Chinese investments and development in Afghanistan. Angelo, anything you want to add to that?
Just about the SCO, what is interesting about SCO is just there's in the goal, it's stated that there's a respect for the cultures and also non-interference of internal affairs. So it's there's no this whole cooperation. It's interesting how in Asia they see cooperation, and in the West they see cooperation. In the West, it's aid and cooperation are tied to conditions. There are conditions, I give you a loan, but under certain conditions, you open your market so I can get my cooperation to you country and I can buy state-owned assets. I want the democracies that are actually going to the directions of the NATO countries. In Asia, it's different. I want to give you an example of the IMF, the World Bank, and the new bank that China created, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. IMF and World Bank, you have in the IMF, it's always a European that is at the head of the IMF. In the World Bank, it's an American. US in both banks has veto power. So, talking about democracy, it's not it's not very democratic. But then the Chinese bank, China has 26% voting right because it's the main investors. but it has no veto power. It's more like democratic, and everything that is going through that, it's no tight. There is no string attached. It's about doing business. There's no preconditions. It's not about like interference in a country's affair. You don't want to change countries, or you don't want to change a culture, and impose actually Western values or Asian values. No, China is about doing business. And then first prosperity, and then there are lots of good things that are going to come out of prosperity. While in the West, it's a different world, is that we are going to change things. Let me give you freedom that you cannot eat, human rights that are my human rights, not your human rights. It's about definition. And then maybe we'll take care about your prosperity. It doesn't make any sense. People need to eat first. They need to eat first. They need to have access to education, universal healthcare. That's what this is what people want. It's just factual. Why impose things on people that they don't need, especially when you are a developing country. When you are developing countries, you have aspiration of being able to live up to 70 years old. This is an aspiration. You give me freedom, and I'm going to live up to 40 years old. What does it give it to me? I have a freedom to complain, but in the West, you complain, but nothing changed.
Exactly.
What is the point? It's hypocrisy.
And then if you do complain, but in a way that actually endangers all of their rackets, you go to jail immediately. Just look at Julian Assange or Edward Snowden. They would like to put him in jail. Or Daniel Hale, who's in jail for exposing how destructive and murderous the U.S. drone program was. I just want to kind of point that, because you were just saying about how China does not. First of all, people might be skeptical that the SCO won't interfere, but we already have an organization, ASEAN, in Southeast Asia. They have a strong non-interference principle, and they adhere to it. So they were put under a lot of pressure to meddle in Myanmar, and they're not doing it, and it's driving the West crazy. And I have a funny feeling that the SCO is going to work in a very similar way. Now, this is from The Diplomat. This is a very pro-Western, pro-intervention publication. Does the Belt and Road have a future in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan? And then it says the Taliban will welcome the hard infrastructure elements of the BRI. The soft components are a different story. And they're trying to claim that China is going to impose all of these conditions like women's rights, et cetera, on the Taliban. And I don't think that they're going to. And the crux of their argument is that because China recognizes women's rights, they're going to insist that the Taliban do likewise. And maybe in relation to Chinese nationals working in Afghanistan, but they're not going to tell the Taliban or the Afghans how to live their life. They don't even have the organizations or institutions to impose that sort of condition on anyone, unlike the US, who has the National Endowment for Democracy and eagerly meddles in everybody's business. So there's all of that. And so right now, it's kind of wait and see what happens. China is already in Afghanistan. They're already doing business in Afghanistan. They have plans to develop infrastructure. They have a mining project that they've already invested in, and they're working for years now to get going. And really, the only thing that's going to hinder it is security. And this is something the U.S. is going to attempt to hold hostage, peace and prosperity in Afghanistan, by just doing what they always do, destabilizing. We just talked about Myanmar and how the U.S. is essentially fighting a proxy war against China and its influence in Myanmar, the relationship between Myanmar and China through these U.S.-backed proxies. One point that I will close in on, and I'll give you the last word, Angelo, and maybe we could keep this at 45 minutes. Information space is extremely important for every nation to protect and control, just like their airspace, their shores, and their borders. And a lot of people don't think about it this way, but this is so key. And in Myanmar, these kids, these opposition movements are completely brainwashed. It's not a case where they came to these ideas on their own, or they are pursuing this agenda on their own. This was put into their head through decades of US-sponsored propaganda, through the NED, through Open Society, through all of these adjacent so-called aid organizations. They have done this to these people. They have disfigured them culturally, psychologically, socially, politically, and now they are at war against their own country. This is not about freedom of speech or freedom of expression. When people get seized by an idea that does not represent their own best interests or the interests of their country, just like extremism, no one's going to argue that Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they have the right to have these views and pursue these objectives. They don't. It's not even in their own best interest to do that. And so this is very important for controlling information space. And I just think like it would be really great if countries like Russia and China found a way to export the means to protect information space the same way they export the means to protect physical airspace and shores through defense, selling defense systems. Angelo, do you have anything else to add about China in Afghanistan? This whole topic about U.S.-China, I would say conflict more so than competition.
Well, we need to look at the root of the problem. Why the U.S. went to Afghanistan? I mean, the excuse, it was a war on terror. And when you look at what are they never actually ask themselves, what is the root of terrorism? Why? It's very simple. It's people are in remote areas. They are poor. There's no prosperity. There's a low level of education. I mean, keep in mind, that there's only a small percentage of people in Afghanistan that have access to education. So the US went in, and they went in with weapon and just controlling and trying to change the people, but they didn't take care of the root of the problem, which China did in Xinjiang. China was victim of ETIM terrorists, ETIM, which is backed by the US, by the way. And what did they do? They took care of the root of the problems. Why do you have radicals? Because people have no prospect for future. When you have no future, and then you have these those imams, which are Wahhabi, funded by Saudi Arabia, by the US, which are coming to China and saying, well, let's build an Islamic State and so on. How you manipulate kids. In reality, bring them prosperity. I'm no expert. You and I, we don't have PhDs, but the root of the problem is poverty. People have no future. So why don't you bring some prosperity to people? You build roads, you build infrastructure, you build schools, you build hospitals. With 10% of the money they spend in Afghanistan, they would have built a very prosperous nation, and it could have been an example. What happened? I mean, nothing. It just made rich the military-industrial complex. This war on terror, we are talking about $6.4 trillion over 20 years time, talking about $20,000 per American taxpayers. It was just one of the biggest wealth transfer in human history. So what I want to add here is just how the difference between how US is dealing with terrorism and how China is dealing with terrorism. Look at the root of the problem. What the US did is actually creating more terrorists. Those mothers that lost a kid because of US presence in Afghanistan, she's the most radical. It's going to fuel more terrorism and resentment against the US. And it's going to please the military-industrial complex, because you need an enemy to justify $1 trillion spent on defense every year. And it's not defense. I mean, we should rename this. This is not defense. This is attack, Yeah,
absolutely. That is a perfect point to close on. The future of Afghanistan is going to be a battle between those waging war against poverty and those waging war in favor of poverty. The U.S. just spent 20 years in Afghanistan demonstrating which side of that battle they're on. And now it's China's turn to come in there, along with their other SCO partners, to try to stabilize and build up Afghanistan, to try to replicate the achievements that they've made in Xinjiang, because that's absolutely the reason why the U.S. is against China and what they were doing in Xinjiang. Not because the U.S. is against surveilling extremists, because they do that, and they surveil everyone else, including their own allies. Not about detaining, because they have Guantanamo Bay detention camp and torture dungeons all around the globe. So they're definitely not upset about China for detaining people. They're upset because when China detains extremists, they deprogram the brainwashing that resulted in extremism. Then they give them skills so that they could go rejoin society in a constructive way and have a second chance at life, which is better for the public, the general public who are threatened by extremism, and better for that individual. Because just in New Zealand, just recently, there was a knife attack, and the suspect was under surveillance by the New Zealand police 24/7. They had an armed team following him around everywhere he went. What did that do to help the public? The 6 people got stabbed and injured, and the suspect was killed. So how did that do any good for anyone involved in that case? If he was deprogrammed, given a skill, and reintroduced into society, he would have had a second chance at life. Public would have been safer. The whole country would have done better. So it really is a stark contrast between East and West, and Afghanistan is kind of a showcase of this. I want to thank you again, Angelo, for bringing your expertise to this topic. I learned something new every single time we do this. Thank you so much. Everyone who's watching, thank you so much. Check the video description. Again, there's going to be a lot of resources there for people to kind of look into this on their own. There's going to be a lot of information in there. Like and share the video. And until next week, bye for now.
Thank you.